Welcome to Writing the West podcast. Our guest today is best-selling author and historian Bryan Burrough, who joins us to discuss the real stories behind the Old West's most infamous gunfighters.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Tyler, you can hear me? I'm all right.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're glad to have you.
I am thrilled to be here. Every
Perfect.
time I go, my wife comes from a ranching family out in West Texas. And every time we go to the main ranch there, outside Junction, and I walk in and on the coffee table, it's always at least one and usually two issues of Cowboys and Indians. Uh,
Wonderful. We're glad to hear that.
Her father is a big fan and always has an issue out.
Perfect. Well, we're glad to have you on because a lot of the books that you've written about, and obviously the new one, The Gunfighters, Forget the Alamo, you've written a number of books on the Old West. And that takes me into my first question. After books like Barbarians at the Gate, Public Enemies, what led you to write about the American West?
It was really the process of writing this book, Public Enemies, which a few people may remember from 20 years ago. More people may be familiar with it as a Johnny Depp, Christian Bale movie from a few years back. But, writing about gangsters and bank robbers and outlaws in the 1930s and talking about how they came about, obviously you glance back where the last time that outlaws and people with guns seem to attract fascination by the American public. And look, I've been reading. I got my first gunfighter book. I don't remember which one it was. I think it was Billy the Kid when I was 11. So I have been reading on it for a long time. But Tyler, I just never. It wasn't until then that I really began to think of it as something that I wanted to do next. The problem was I couldn't come up initially. This was 20 years ago, back in 04, 05. I couldn't come up initially with a way to tie it all together. I didn't want to write one more of these books, and some of them are okay, that's 17 chapters on 17 gunfighters. I wanted to be able to tell the whole story as a single story. And it took me off and on, over 10 years to come up with a way to do that. And finally, I started this book. Well, I worked on this book off and on for 7 years.
Wow, quite an undertaking. And what about, the idea for you especially led you to that impetus of the gunfighter? Because there's so many topics about the American West. What about the gunfighter really stuck with you?
Well, it was not the West that drew me. It was Gunfighter that drew me to the West rather than the West drawing me to the Gunfighter. Um, I felt that look, the first thing to get across when you're looking at a book is you have to know you are basically withdrawing into a room physically and some literally and emotionally for 5 years. So you better be fascinated by the topic. And I was fascinated by the topic. So the question began, how look, I set my bar pretty high. The publisher expects it. People who read my books expect it. That if I'm going to go into a new field, I've got to say something big. I've got to, in my mind, I've got to reimagine the field. I've got to really contribute something. So it just took me a while to figure out what I could do in the field of gunfighters, which people have been writing about for 150 years. What could I do that felt fresh and new and reimagining? And I like to believe, obviously, that I've done that. We'll see if readers agree.
Well, and you've written on a number of subjects, both modern and historical. Does your approach differ when it comes to a more historical focus like the gunfighters?
Yes and no. I mean, look, my books. This is the eighth one. Certainly, my first five or six were classic, kind of top-down, serious, research-heavy books. Um, and something changed on the last book I wrote 4 years ago, which was called "Forget the Alamo." In an effort not to alarm and upset Texans, I wanted the book to not be preachy, not because it was advancing alternate ideas about the Alamo and the creation of Texas. So I really wanted it to be what I kept saying was a friendly book, conversational. Not a important author, but more like a guy you were sitting down to have beer or a cup of coffee with. And I found that that voice was natural to me. I just wrote the way I talked, and I people responded pretty positively. So I decided that's what I wanted. That was the first thing I wanted to do with Gunfighters was um, was make it friendly and accessible and easy for people. Not, I'm forgetting your question. I hope I answered it.
No, that was great. And what's really struck me about the opening of this book, you open with the Hickok Tut duel,
Yep.
and it does strike me as just someone sitting around having a drink, telling a story. And it was captivating right from the beginning. My question about that opening was why start there? What made that moment so fundamental for the
Well,
story you were about to tell?
one of the things, if you're just a lay person out sitting in your car, you think gunfighters, and it's just this enormous, subject. Like, really, there's hundreds of these people, right? Or at least dozens. How do you make a single story out of that? Well, the wonderful thing about the gunfighter era, as I'm calling it, from 1865 to 1901, is it has a beginning, and the and that is the Hickok Tut gunfight. It was not, as some would have you believe, the first Old West gunfight, but it was the first Old West gunfight that attracted national attention after the Civil War. And so I thought, wow, that is the natural place to start the story. Now, as you no doubt know, and as aficionados no doubt know, um, a lot of Western histories uh, tend to talk about gunfighters only after the Civil War, and they leave out entirely the 10 years of kind of manic gunfighter violence in gold rush era California. So I do back into that. I get it. I don't forget California, but I'm really telling I treat California as kind of a prologue. I'm really trying to write what I view as the first narrative history of what I'm calling the gunfighter era that begins with Hickok and Tut there in Springfield, Missouri, July 29th, 1865. And the story begins when Butch and Sundance get on that freighter in Brooklyn for South America in 1901. I thought I can make that work.
And what defined that window to you? And why does 1865 to 1901, loom so large in the legend of Old West gunfighters?
Well, you're right in that it's arbitrary. I'm the one who's defining that that's the gunfighter era. So that's fair. Look, the first thing is 1865 to 1901 encompasses the beginning and the career of everyone you've ever heard of. Like I mean, from Billy the Kid to Wild Bill Hickok to Wyatt Earp, none of them were shooting people before 1865 or doing it after 1901. Of well-known gunfighters, I would say Frank Hamer, the vaunted Texas Ranger, is one of the few whose career went past 1901. So, but look, I knew I wanted to include Butch and Sundance, even though they're more outlaws than gunfighters. Still, it felt like their story belonged in the book. And look, what better way to end the story of this era than when the last brand name outlaws literally flee the country? It just felt like a natural place to end. I'm not saying, I make very, very clear, look, gunfights went on, bank robberies still went on. But after 1901, you get a sense that, we know the frontier had closed, that this was all kind of moving from headlines to history.
Exactly. And you described gunfighters in that era as, the American Achilles, the American Thor, the American Lancelot. And what about that archetype that the gunfighters fulfilled was uniquely American to you in your research?
To me, this all came down to, I mean, first off, what's the principal allure of the West? And when I drill down to it, I read a lot of smart academics, a lot smarter than me. It really came down to me to kind of an American worship of individualism. That you can look at a lot of the things that make the American character unique. But I think when you compare it to the German or the Swiss or the Austrian or the Libyan character, a lot of it has to do with individualism. And I suspect that one reason, not the only reason, but one reason that the West and its myths and facts remain so appealing is that sense that the frontier years were a unique period for the American as an individual. Back east, you had politicians and preachers everywhere and lots of rules and laws. But the fact is, men shot each other on the streets every day in Boston and Baltimore, and nobody remembers them. But they did when they did it in Abilene and Tombstone. We remember them, and so I think a lot of it has to do with that American prizing of individualism.
Were you surprised at all, given the time span that you laid out for this book, at really how short the gunfighter era was compared to the legacy that it's left behind over the last 150 years?
The reviews so far have been very generous, and that's something that a couple of people have said surprised them, that really gunfighters, all these people were out there in the same 35 years, or at least overlapping during it. It didn't surprise me at all. Look, like you, probably, I've been reading this stuff since I was 11. I never really thought about gunfighters before the war. I learned here, and I certainly didn't think about them after 1901, or at least until the Depression era bank robbers of the 1930s. So no, that didn't surprise me. I'm surprised people were surprised, just because this is the look. If you like the West, this is the water you swim in, right? I've been swimming in this water in terms of, I mean, I get every book, everything new that comes out. So no, it didn't surprise me.
Well, and a big crux of your book, obviously, is, you make the case that the gunfighter is a Texan product. And what about Texas during that time period made it such a fertile ground for gunfighters?
Well, I do. This ended up being, if you felt like, if Bryan Burrough is going to try to write this book about an entire period, there has to be something that links all these gunfighters. Well, it's pretty clear to me from the beginning that that had to be behavioral, since their stories are all so different, right? So the question became, wait, why gunfighters? Why did they become a thing on the Old West? Why did it fascinate us? But more importantly, was the Old West as violent as it appears in movies? Answer: yes, absolutely. We know that now from data science in the 21st century. And so if you accept that, the question is, the thing that hit me first, Tyler, is holy, holy, holy God. There were Texans in seemingly every major gunfight, it seemed like, and I didn't understand that. So I realized I had to understand the behaviors that led to gunfighting, and I trace it really to the antebellum South, to the dueling culture, and to the incredible importance in the South of male honor codes, defending your honor, this type of thing. Texas was every inch a Southern state, but then really, I think what changed was the incredible violence that broke out in Texas in the decade after the Civil War, from 1865 into the mid 70s. Texas was an immensely proud place that had not been conquered during the Civil War. It was just occupied afterwards. And there broke out two waves of violence that were significant, and that led to, some academics will tell you, Texas after the war was the most violent place in American history. The first was fighting back against that occupation. The second was the rise of the first great business in the Old West, which was open range cattle business, which came almost exclusively from Texas, and because it was open range, it was uniquely prone to theft, to rustling, and that's the reason Texas cattlemen became, well, pretty darn adept at stopping and killing and lynching and rustlers. That incredible wellspring of violence in Texas, I'm arguing in this book, ultimately broke across the West, and the first step up was the cattle trails. The Chisholm Trail and other trails to Kansas. That's why those Kansas cow towns became really what I call, the Madison Square Garden of the gunfighter era.
Well, and you mentioned a lot already about, the individualism of the gunfighter, of this idea of Southern honor and the dueling tradition that a lot of these gunfighters came from. Was there a common, personality type among these men too that extended just beyond, these preconceived traditions?
I wanted to be alert to that, but one of the things I like the most is, while I feel like we can generalize about some of the behaviors that led to all these gunfights, the primacy of male honor and all this. The fact is, each of these guys is startlingly different. There are gunfighters that you will like and maybe want to have a beer with. Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, I think we're pretty great guys. John Wesley Hardin, for instance, probably not so much. I think he was pretty much a maniac. Um, one of the things I wanted to do is not turn these people into cartoon characters. But if I'm going to be credible about this, I have to, you know, retrieve them as men, as actual, like most men. There's good things about each of them and bad things. A few things that they had in common. I mean, the first thing that jumps out of you is a number of them, maybe a quarter, were kind of diehard rebels. Jesse James, Hardin, Doc Holliday were people who were deeply marinated in Southern traditions. Didn't take to Yankees, especially Yankee sheriffs. So there was a lot of that, especially in the early days. But after that, it's hard to generalize. Other than the fact that a lot of the gunfighters who were outlaws, who obviously didn't have much, they didn't care much for the written law. But just in terms of personality, everything under the sun.
Well, and we've stewed on it for the first 20 minutes. We've talked about, the Civil War being such an impetus for this entire gunfighter culture. And, what role did, and we see that economy of Confederate Union soldiers, what role did that play in shaping who they became? Because I think that already had existed, that natural dichotomy between a lot of these men.
I could cite a few things. One, obviously, if we just reference, is the fact that there was lingering bad blood between Southerners against Northerners. That clearly contributed. That was a contributing factor to some of the gun violence that we saw, some of the gunfights we saw in Kansas. Um, and then, there have been some things written just in the last 20 years. The Smithsonian had a great exhibit on this about PTSD after the Civil War, and so you at least have to look at the fact that it's possible that some of these gunfighters who were veterans were suffering from PTSD. You can't prove it, but we know, like, Clay Allison, the New Mexico gunfighter, he was discharged in part because of episodes he had. We know, I speculate that Ben Thompson, the famous Texas gambler gunfighter, a lot of his behavior feels like PTSD, but that's just speculative. Really, that type of thing will never be proven. What you can point to, though, Tyler, is the incredible change in the use of personal weapons in the 1860s after the war. A lot of men returned home with guns, but even more got guns because the federal government auctioned or gave away 1.3 million sidearms. And you see it a lot in memoirs written during, or in which people wrote about that period. People, open carry was not unheard of in the U.S., but it became much more prevalent in those years after the 1860s. And the whole nature of violence, dueling suddenly, now that everybody has a revolver, kind of goes away. Even one of my favorite memoirists said, even the penchant to, grappling and wrestling and fist fighting it diminished, as this one memoirist said. Those things are now handled much quicker with guns, with revolvers.
Well, one thing that, you mentioned early on is that so many of us in today's age, have been influenced by Hollywood, by retellings of the legends of these men. And I know that was part of your research too. Where did Hollywood get it right? Where did they miss the mark? Basically, how accurate have Hollywood portrayals been about gunfighters?
It's like asking a question about doctors or lawyers or journalists. There's good movies and there's bad movies. I would say that the longer we've gone on, the movies in general have been more prone to be accurate because there's lots of people out on the internet in the world, individual voices that prefer these things to be so. The gunfighter really wasn't a thing, or didn't become popular till silent movies, and really was rediscovered in the 1920s. So that's really when Hollywood got to it. And I would say in general that the first 30 or 40 years of Hollywood movies tended to be a little bit less accurate than the 50 years we've seen since. Certainly beginning in the 70s, you started to see movies that made a real effort, beginning with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which is not crazy and accurate. I mean, that's 80% accurate, I would guess. Um, on through movies like Tombstone, the Kurt Russell Tombstone, which I kind of think is great. Even the Kevin Costner Wyatt Earp movie, which kind of puts me to sleep, was pretty close to accurate. So the sad thing is that as westerns have gotten a tad more accurate, we have to point out, become a lot considerably less popular. There's just not as many westerns now as they used to be, and I think a lot of that is because if you think about it, with I must nod toward Taylor Sheridan stuff, but with the exception of those, a lot of the stories that used to get set in the old west now get set in outer space.
Yeah, more grounded in reality now, I guess you'd say.
Yeah,
Well, and one of those things in particular, you mentioned that the fast draw was really more of a Hollywood fantasy than historical fact. And can you talk for a second about what these gunfights were actually like and what the experiences of these men would have been?
the fast draw was first written about, or came to popularized by a book during the 1930s, and then Texas, Hollywood, and especially television in the 1950s really took to it. We know from comments that Hickok made, from Earp and from Ben Thompson, that the best gunfighters did not prize speed less than accuracy. The Tut Hickok gunfight that you mentioned at the beginning, that begins my book, you know, Davis Tutt on the north side of the square that afternoon does the thing that you see in every the bonehead thing that everybody does in every movie. From a distance of 70 yards, he pulls and fires from the hip. That is not an accurate shot. Hickok took a split second longer, thrust his left arm forward, placed the barrel of his Navy Colt across the left forearm, and aimed. Shot him in the chest and killed him. And from comments that Hickok and Thompson and Earp made, you could tell that accuracy was more important. If you look at the gunfight beside the OK Corral, I mean, those idiot cowboys died mostly because they did the same thing. They fired, and Earp and Holiday both took a second longer to make sure that their bullets hit. That all that said, that type of the type of kind of formal gunfight that Hickok and Tutt engaged in, it felt very much like a duel, right? Only with revolvers. That type of thing, and I'm not the first to point this out, was pretty darn rare in the West. I mean, in terms of like two guys in the street, draw type thing, you can find maybe a dozen, maybe 10 episodes like that. Um, but what you did see a lot more of in the West, because look, let's be clear, Westerners even then had less appetite for formalities than Easterners. What you do see in the West that kind of sounds like that, and you see this in the literature a lot, is two guys getting in an argument in a saloon, and somebody says something that sounds like a throwaway line. It often involves the use of the word outside. I'll see you outside. Let's take this outside. What is that other than an informal, casual invitation to a duel? So I think that's kind of, obviously the parallels that I'm drawing with the Old South and all that has more to do with the causes of Western gun violence. But even there, you can see some echo of kind of the dueling culture. Let's take it outside.
Right, and I get this sense through, all the duels and the gunfights that you speak about in the book that a big part of this was, your reputation. And obviously that has its beginnings in, the Southern tradition of duels and as it was. But, these men are obviously risking their lives, over words, which in today's sensibilities we maybe can't understand. But why was it so important for, these gunfighters to, I guess, uphold their end of the bargain when it came to these reputations?
Boy, I'm like you too. I mean, when you look at the causes of the things that triggered the gunfight there on Fremont Street in Tombstone, they were just arguments. I mean, like, really, you got to shoot each other over this? I mean, I'm with you. Why? and really the only way that I can come to grips with that is to internalize, to really believe the, that the way American men, especially in rural and frontier areas, measured themselves in those days was by honor, was by respect, would be another way to say it. At a time where, let's be clear, not a lot of people were rich, so I can't necessarily be one cowboy isn't going to be stunningly richer than the next guy. He's certainly not going to have more education than the next guy. How do you how do you how do you measure? Well, I remember how we measured on the playground in elementary school. It was who was tougher, who was scarier, who was the bully, and I think that's a lot of what you saw in the Old West.
Yeah, and you mentioned too that we really didn't have this sense of the gunfighter until, you know, in a public conscience idea until after it was over. Were there, admiration that these men received during their own time, or was that more relegated to like the early pulps and television screenplays?
Great question, because that's something that always fascinates me, is how big a deal were these people at the time? As a class of gunfighter, the word dates to 1874. It's the first time people have found it in a newspaper. So the concept of a guy who's famous for killing people, it really began with Hickok. He created that archetype. It was created for him in a magazine article back east. Um, so everybody knew who Hickok was. People knew who Earp was, but I would say generally they were more regionally famous than nationally famous. And while we kind of want to laugh at Easterners writing about dime novels, let's be clear: these people were most popular, were the biggest deal in the places that they lived, in the regions where they lived. Um, but as John Boesnecker and others have pointed out long before I came along, the gunfighter was just not a huge deal in 19th century, especially 19th century fiction. If you go back and look at those dime novels, and I'm sure you have, they're mostly about Indian fighters and detectives. And, the gunfighter might rank as an archetype, fifth or seventh. It really wasn't until the 1920s that the gunfighter was discovered or rediscovered with this great article in which you get some sense of how off the radar the Old West had fallen for 30 years, with this one magazine article that starts off by the writer saying, "Who remembers Billy the Kid?" And that was 1925, and that began the rediscovery, first in best-selling books and then in Hollywood. That's when the gunfighter first became a thing.
Well, and I will say, speaking of, admiration in their own time, we spoke with George Matthews, who wrote a recent biography of Billy the Kid.
Right.
And in that book, he discusses how most people in the time period, at least for Billy the Kid, saw a lot of what he did as justified. How much of that did you find, especially with these Texas gunfighters? And how many of them did the public maybe tend to think of as just kind of this loose cannon or murderer versus a more justified?
The reputations were all over their reputations were all over the place.
Okay.
But what's interesting is when you think about a gunfighter, to be successful, you have to kill people, right? So you would think these people were forever getting arrested and put in prison. You would be wrong. Obviously there was legal doctrine at that time of the point, that time, that was kind of a defend your ground type thing. And also certainly a broad sense in America, and especially in rural and frontier areas, um, that a man it was okay to defend your honor with deadly force. So you see a lot of these guys are arrested over and over and over. Ben Thompson down in Austin, he's arrested a half dozen times. He gets off every single time. It's unusual for a gunfighter to get put away in prison. One of the few, in fact, the biggest name was clearly John Wesley Hardin, who was put away for what he got a 25-year sentence. I think he served 17. Um, and then, while Bill Longley, who was long celebrated or reviled as the second most famous Texas gunfighter, he's since been revealed to be a fraud. He was one of the few gunfighters to go to the gallows. Tom Horn in Wyoming obviously was another, but especially in the early years, in the 60s and 70s, you didn't see a lot of consequences for a lot of this killing.
Well, and what I think endures for most people with the idea of this gunfighter is that, like you said, they had such little, economic or political pull in their own time period as not necessarily a unit, but just as maybe a profession, I guess, in some of these ways. But it's so central to the American identity at this point. And obviously, Hollywood had a role in that. But, why do you think that that idea has endured, even just in the last 100 years from the 20s and 30s dime novels and movies?
Well, part of it is the gunfighter is not a new concept. If you think back to entertainments and literature in Europe and Asia, what is he but a 20th century American version of the samurai or the Russian Cossack? Every every or I should say many of older cultures have stories built around solo men of action. So there's that to begin with, and then I think what makes it more so is the fascination and worship even of individualism. I mean, before the gunfighter, you had the fascination with the gunfighter was preceded by the fascination with the frontiersman, which began with leather stocking tales with James Fenimore Cooper, and then moving into nonfiction with the public fascination by David Crockett and Daniel Boone. All of that, I think, led to the incredible popularity of the gunfighter archetype.
Well, and you brought up a great point about, the solo gunfighter. He's always this man that stands on his own, which is, it definitely reflects, the American values, but also is kind of contradictory too, in that, we have this country coming together, after the Civil War, trying to determine, who are we as a group again. And how do you feel like this idea of like this lone gunman, reflects and contradicts those American values? Have you thought about that?
I thought that the key thing here, and I don't want to get anywhere near politics because the book doesn't get anywhere near
Yeah.
politics, but just looking at the facts, look, what there is no greater equalizer in the world if you're under threat than a gun, right? You can be any size, shape, or color, but if you've got a gun and we're at odds, we should be equal, unless one guy's got a machine gun and the other guy has a 22. But I mean, generally speaking, we are equal, and I think in a country that has, the part of the American dream has always been that any man or woman on his own can make it in this country, that we're all equal. I think there's something about the fact that a gun makes us all equal on the field of combat. I think that's appealing to us.
Yeah, yeah, and I was going to ask this too at the beginning because you've written on Public Enemies and much later stories that involve so many similar aspects to them. You
Yeah.
know, did you feel in that prior research, now that you've also gone back and looked at the gunfighter era, any legacy that was carried over into the ideas of these bank robbers and all of those in the more modern era?
Well, I mean, clearly you can find, and it's fascinating. There's a period from 1900 to 1930 when there weren't a ton of famous bank robbers and rural criminals, but they did exist, and they represent this kind of transition from the old ones. I mean, you can find there were people like Henry Starr in Oklahoma that started off robbing banks on horseback and ended in cars. And to
Wow.
me, that is just incredibly cool. But I mean, so I'm never going to be able to get a book out of that, but it's still really cool. But for me, look, I would love to come across to you as a more complicated guy, but in some way, I'm still that 11-year-old boy who's fascinated by cops and robbers. I
Yeah.
wrote about him in Public Enemies. I think I've written about it pretty well in Gunfighter. And 2 books ago, I wrote a book about radical groups bombing things during the 1970s. I like big, intricate stories of good and evil, or people in combat. I should probably write war books, but I haven't.
Well, and what was so prevalent, obviously, in Public Enemies was that that cops and robbers, dichotomy. And you also delve into it in Gunfighters too, and you mentioned it earlier with men like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson. And what interests me so much about this era, as I'm sure it did for you, was that obviously you had men on the other side of the gunfighters who were attempting to hold up these laws, however difficult that was, but also men that maybe straddled the line, between the two. What did you find in your research that kind of helped you understand the lawman side of the gunfighter?
I will tell you that, every book when you get done, you look at it. And I love this book, but if I had to write another chapter, I would have written a chapter just about lawmen, sheriffs, and the Texas Rangers. I think I probably should have given them a little bit more, um, because I don't spend a lot of time looking at the good and evil here. To my mind, it's just the way I come about things. I tend to see everything in shades of gray. I see all these guys do wonderful things and do really bad things. That's just the way life is. Um, but I was struck, and again, I'm certainly not the first person to make this observation, but you are struck anytime you write about Old West gunfighters or the Old West as how fluid people moved across from outlawry to law enforcement. The woods are full of people like mysterious Dave Mather, who is, after being jailed or convicted of theft in Fort Worth, goes to Dodge City to become a deputy. I mean, there almost every town like that. I mean, first off, look, little towns in the middle of nowhere with 800 people, they don't have fax machines where they're checking people's
No
resume.
background checks.
So if the guy can twirl a gun and he looks clean, that was enough to get you hired as a deputy in most places, especially early in that time. It is one of the things that is interesting in the book is you really see the advancement, the professionalization of Old West law enforcement when you look at the kind of the knuckleheads that were chasing John Wesley Hardin and Billy the Kid early on as they morph into the really incredibly professional federal marshals that chased people like the Daltons in the 1890s.
Well, that's always so interesting to me too, that, the law and how we enforce it is always a reflection of the men who break the law first and how savvy they are at doing so, like the Pinkertons, like the Texas Rangers. I wanted to pivot just for a second about, into modern storytelling because you brought up like Taylor Sheridan. We're starting to see a little bit of a resurgence, not necessarily of just traditional Westerns, but storytelling based in the West. And having done the extensive research you did for this book, do you see any echoes of that gunfighter stereotype in any of our modern storytelling films? I mean, even I see, I guess, some of it, and even politics today, and how we approach opponents in that American way.
I didn't really go there.
Okay.
I Look, one of the things that I was concerned with writing about gun violence in the 19th century is that people would try to make this book or cite this book or get me wrapped up in the politics of gun policy. I could not have less interest. So I assiduously kept my focus on the 19th century. And other than talking a little bit about the development of the gunfighter idea in popular literature and films, I stayed I stayed all as far apart from that stuff as I could.
Well, and you had copious amounts of interesting stories to tell, that's for sure, in that time period.
I had no lack of stories. The main challenge of this book was just choosing. Look, everybody knows I'm going to tell the stories of the big four or five guys, but then it becomes who you going to keep in and who you going to let out. Because there are people like Pink Higgins, there were people like Luke Short, who even Bill Doolin, that people I mentioned their names at a party, and people just are like, oh yeah, I'm sure that's fascinating. Never heard of the guy. So there are people like that I really want to reclaim and really go out and just say, this guy has the coolest stories.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I get paid to do.
Well, yeah, and because the book is so extensive and really gives such a raw insight into these men's lives and obviously the effect that they had on the West and gunfighter culture. You know Is there an overarching theme or message that you hope readers take away from the book?
No, I want, look, as with all my books, Tyler, I figured this out early on. The first thing I want to do is entertain. I want to get you to the end. And at the end, if you turn around and go, I think I learned something there too, then I've done my job. But primarily, I want this to be entertaining and interesting for people. And if they learn something along the way, that's fine. But I am not going to tell you what to learn.
There you go. Well, and my last question for you today is if you could sit down with any of these men, Wild Bill, Bat Masterson, any of these men, who would you pick and what would you ask them?
It would be Earp because I want to know, he had such a reputation, well earned, for being, upright, to upholding the law. And then when his two brothers are shot, one killed, he goes rogue. He becomes a vigilante after years of, standing in front of vigilante crowds, of lynch mobs, and he crossed the line. And I would want to talk to him about that.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Brian. I've had such a great conversation. I think we have episodes, countless episodes to talk about these men and their stories, and that's what makes the West so interesting.
I agree, Tyler. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real honor.
Well, and if anyone hasn't read The Gunfighters, How Texas Made the West Wild by Bryan Burrough, obviously go out and check it out, and you won't be disappointed.
It's great for Father's Day, the publisher always tells me to say.
Exactly. Perfect gift for dads. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate your time.
Tyler, thanks.